Velkommen og god dag alle sammen. Here's another video about Seidr. Today we're going to be speaking about just how common was it to find Völva or a Seidr practitioner in the Viking Age or pre-Christian age in general. Were they kind of mythic creatures, mysterious people that the regular person never really came in contact with, or were they a bit more relatable to the average person? Because in the sagas, it seems like contact with a Völva and seeing the act of Seidr was really rare, actually, and we only hear a few stories of Seidr detailing what it was, and we know that it was pretty much only performed for kings or men of high status. The Völva were traveling and they stopped in town and they maybe did some work for a king, and it just doesn't seem like the regular person could afford or even witness Seidr. But there is some archaeological evidence that tells us something different. Now, most archaeological finds, I'll admit, are of people that we believe to be Völva, and they're just kind of like lone wolves. There's only about 40 grave sites that we are sure that it was Völva or a Seidr practitioner. And they were all spread out over Scandinavia and even the British Isles, and even one in Russia, actually. But either way, they were in kind of remote places, buried one at a time, kind of mysterious, kind of separated from everything else or actual settlements. The problem is that these burials, they seem kind of like lone wolves. So this kind of evidence actually agrees with the saga's accounts of Völva, showing that these women were very rare to find, and they were traveling around, and the only ones who really had any contact with them were kings or perhaps their family in a small village. However, we do find a couple of burials from archaeological finds that Völva were found in relatively large settlements, some of the biggest settlements of the time, and there were multiple women buried there separately from each other. So this suggests perhaps that in larger urban environments, Völva and Seidr, they would have been practiced a bit more often. They would have been a bit more accessible to the average person. So let's look at these. There's two. First one is at Birka, Sweden. And now Birka is one of the most important and largest archaeological sites we have from the Viking Age. It was a huge settlement and a trading center, and it brought people in from all over the world, but it was completely abandoned. It was founded in the mid-700s, they think, and abandoned by the year 975 for an unknown reason. A lot of these big settlements were abandoned for unknown reasons in the Viking Age. So there's absolutely nothing there since for 1,000 years. So archaeologists have been able to dig up pretty much everything in a vast area that used to be Birka, and they had hundreds or even thousands of digs, and among these they found at least 3 women that they are sure to be Völva in graves 660, 834, and 845. Now keep in mind that these are just the ones that they are sure about. I spoke about this in my other video that I just did, but if we found 3, we could assume that there are for sure more than that based on the items that we find in these graves and some of these other graves. Now, exactly what's in those graves I won't go into because we're not looking at that in this video. What we're trying to do is find out how common was a Völva, and could a regular person expect to see Seidr, or was it kind of just a mysterious thing reserved for kings of the time? So if we find 3 Völva here, let's look at the actual details of the city and population and see what that tells us. Well, the estimated population of Birka at any given time was said to be from 500 to 1,000 people. So think of it like a tourist town. Probably 500 people living there year-round, but maybe another 500 that were just staying there for a visit, and then they leave, and 500 more come in, just kind of going in like that, like any other tourist town. It was a trading town after all, mainly, and a lot of people were just passing through for a few days or a few months, whatever. Now, Birka I could talk about for hours and what we know about it, but for this video, we're just looking at the numbers. So for now, let's say we find at least 3 Völva burials, minimum. So Birka was a settlement that only lasted for about 200 years, and these women would have at least lived to 70, 80. That most people, I think the DNA evidence dated them to 70, 80 years old, all of them. So that makes it easily 1 Völva living in Birka at all times of this settlement. And that's not accounting for any other Völva who were living there, but we haven't found enough evidence in their graves to be sure that they actually were Völva. It also doesn't account for any traveling Völva who are maybe staying there in Birka temporarily. So I think easily we can estimate there were at least 2 to 3 Völva practitioner and Seidr practitioners living in Birka at any given time in those 200 years minimum. And that's pretty good, actually. 3 Völva out of 500 to 1,000 people. That's quite a lot. That's pretty much exactly how many doctors we have per person now in the U.S., for example. So we can compare Völva to a town doctor, really. Everybody in town would have known who they were. Yes, they were expensive, probably, but it would have been something that everyone had access to, at least, if they wanted. And Seidr was very often performed in public. This is pretty clear from the sagas, that it wasn't just one king witnessing. It was quite a big group of people witnessing Seidr most of the time in the sagas. So it's something the regular average person probably would have been in contact with. The regular average person could have probably seen Seidr pretty often in these cities. In more rural areas and in smaller tribes, Völva probably came around from time to time and performed for the chieftain or king, but that was in the rural villages. But in a bigger city, she couldn't exactly go to the king every day of the whole year, so she would have had to lower her price and work for the general public, or for people traveling there, just visiting the city. So think of it like an amusement park or other tourist attraction or a tourist city. So right now I'm in Los Angeles, living not too far away from Universal Studios, and tourists visiting the city will pay hundreds and hundreds of dollars to go there to Universal Studios. But me as a local, I'm not paying for that bullshit. I'm not paying hundreds of dollars to go there. Instead, I'll go to the Santa Monica Pier, which is right nearby, at a fraction of the cost, and I like that place. I really enjoy that place, and I go there regularly. So Völva would have been kind of the same thing. Regular people would have had access to Völva in a smaller town like that, and they would have been loved and respected by the town citizens, because remember, they were there to help. And the next archaeological site will help confirm that. So we're looking at the next one. This is number 2. At Kaupang, we also find some Völva burials excavated, and this was a massive city. Now, Kaupang is on the coast of southeastern Norway, and it was just like Birka, a major trading town that had drawn items and people from all over the world, and it was actually a little bigger than Birka. It had at least 1,000 inhabitants at Kaupang, so it was a major trading area that we read about in accounts from medieval England even, and other places in Europe. So a lot of people. This was one of the biggest and best trading centers in all of Scandinavia at one point. But it only lasted about 100 years. It was established around the year 800. And also like Birka, it was completely abandoned, we don't know why, in the early 900s. So the area was totally clear, and it has been for more than 1,000 years, and tons of excavations by archaeologists have happened there. It is thought to be the most important monument in all of Norway from the Viking Age, even though that there are only about 80 graves dug up, as opposed to the hundreds of graves dug in Birka. Birka was, I think the graves dug up was in the thousands, but in Kaupang it was just 80 graves dug up, maybe. I don't know, if a couple people were in each grave, it makes 160 people they found. And I know a little something about this place because that's where I'm from. It's where I grew up a big chunk of my life, and it's home to my family, and has been as far back as our records show. And here's a little map of my grandma's house, actually, on the trail that I would run to Kaupang at least twice a week when I was living there. And it's less than a 10-minute run, so I know a little bit about the area, and I can tell you. So the spots where they did the excavations, I'll put a photo of it here, it's smaller than a football field. If they actually started to dig up more areas around here, I'm sure they would find hundreds and hundreds of more graves. A lot more than 80 graves like they have found. But even in the 80 graves that they have dug up, there is, they think, 2 at least people that were believed to be Völva. They all had the same items and characteristics. Probably the reason they haven't dug up any more graves is because most of this area is all farm properties. It's all farmland, and a lot of cabins near the ocean is people with their summer homes that they go on holiday. So they really can't dig up more areas in this places. People have been living there for a long time since then, but it's still very, very remote. They could dig it up if they wanted to, but probably the farmers don't want them digging that stuff up. And I do know some of those farmers for a long time that have been living there. So if we look at the numbers in Birka, we can maybe estimate 3 or more Völva practitioners per 1,000 people. But if we look here in Kaupang, it is definitely quite a bit more than that. Maybe instead of 3 Völva, Kaupang, it was like 10 per 1,000 people. So there's no way to know for sure, but just speaking about it for the fun of it. But either way, I think this shows that in big towns like this, Völva would be quite a common thing. And people of the town would have been very familiar with the town seer or the town Völva, and because there would have been a few of them in town, and the regular person would have had access to Seidr if they wanted. It might have been expensive, but they could have seen it when she was performing Seidr for someone else, a noble who had more money to pay for it. So a Völva was probably someone that people in this town were very close to. They had close contact with it. They had friendly relationships with it. They were maybe family. And remember, 1,000 people is still not a very large town, actually. Then let's say 1,000 people, and maybe if it was just 10 of those were Völva. They would have been pretty regular, and they would have had families, they would have had friends nearby, they would have been part of the community, and people would have known them. So it is true, most of Scandinavia, the average person would not have had much contact with Völva, and they would not have seen much Seidr. Remember, most of Scandinavia was small tribes of just 50 to 100 people. So the Völva would have traveled from town to town in these more remote areas and only performed for the chieftain or king, like we see in the sagas, just as the sagas say. And like most of the other Völva burials suggest. In the sagas, we see Seidr as a mysterious thing, and the women who practice it were quite feared and kind of distant and put on a pedestal, at the same time as being shamed and looked down upon. But a few of these larger settlements, like Kaupang or Birka, Völva and Seidr practitioners, they would have been much more accessible to the regular person. They would have had neighbors, friends, family in the community. They would have probably been loved and respected. And I think these burials are proof for that. So some may argue, looking at these, that the Völva buried in Birka or Kaupang or other places may not have lived there. Völvas were known to travel a lot, but firstly, they would have only traveled if they needed to. If they had a family and made money all in one city, like Birka or Kaupang, why wouldn't they stay there? Of course they would. And second, if they were just traveling fortune tellers and mysterious witches, do you really think they would have gotten a burial like that? A lot of times they were buried with others in the same grave that we find, with friends or husbands or family or things like that, or animals, maybe their pets or something like that. So we can even look at one example at the Oseberg ship, which is just about a half an hour drive from Kaupang. This was the most luxurious burial in all of Norway at the time, and it was 2 Völva, we believe. Maybe they were even living in Kaupang at the time, and they were buried nearby in their family village or something, who knows. But either way, all of these burials show, at least the ones in the cities, that Völva weren't necessarily thought of as these mysterious, fearful witches like the sagas say. Some Völva would have been very valued and very respected members of the community in the larger settlements like this. So I think we can say that for sure. The sagas suggest that in the more remote parts of Scandinavia, Völva and Seidr would not have been something the regular person would have seen. But if a regular person was in one of these big towns like Kaupang or Birka or some of the other ones at that time, Kattegat, Seidr would have been a pretty common thing, and the regular average person would have been able to see this. So that kind of changes a little bit about the mysteriousness of Seidr. It teaches us a little bit, but we still don't know what Seidr is completely. We'll look at that in other videos, but I hope you enjoyed this one and can learn something from it, and good luck on your quest. Vi ses nästa gång.